Emmy, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Hello, nice to meet you. All these miles away.
It is amazing, isn't it? The technology
Yes,
never ceases to amaze me.
it is amazing. Yeah.
I know, I know.
It's
It's
it's what, it's early in the morning there, is it?
yeah, it's just past 6 a.m. for me.
Oh no, really?
Yes,
Oh gosh. It's 7 o'clock in the evening here.
7 o'clock in the
Yeah.
Friday night, right?
So we're more than 12 hours apart. Yeah. Shocking, isn't it?
It is, I mean, I
Yeah.
tend
So
to,
whichever way you do it, it's never going to work very well, is it,
that's right.
time-wise?
That's
But we
right.
still can do it.
We can still
Yeah.
do it. And I really wanted to do
Yeah.
this. Like I was saying
Yeah.
before the show, I came across your textbook, Existential Counseling and Psychotherapy, about 6 months ago. And found it to just be really practical. I think one of the the downsides or the disadvantages with existential textbooks is they can tend to be quite uh, abstract, esoteric, because we're touching on deep themes here, philosophical themes. But perhaps we should segue into that area straight away, Emmy. Existential psychotherapy. Could you break that down for us? Because that sounds big.
Yeah, well, it is, and that's important. It is a complete shift of the focus of psychotherapy. So normally psychotherapy focuses on aspects of a person's inner world, as it were, and their past and present experiences. But existential therapy addresses a person's difficulties in a much wider frame. So it looks at a person's existence in the round at every possible level with all its contradictions and all its problems. And it also enables people, well, it aims to enable people to get a much clearer idea about what a human existence is for, or what it is like, or how they might think about it in a different way. So it shifts people's kind of connection with their life. And very often, what that does is that it widens the person's horizon. So, where they have felt cramped in their style previously and maybe perseverated about certain obstacles on the path, they begin to see that this path they're on is only one of many possible paths, and that life itself has many other options and possibilities to offer to them than the ones they have currently exploited or are familiar with, even.
Is your experience with existential psychotherapy one that people intentionally dive into, or is it more often the case that they're
Mm.
confronted with their condition and they have to sort of pick up the pieces?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think both are true. Some people get involved in existential work because they actually have specifically existential problems. So they feel very isolated or lonely, or they have existential anxiety, which is a basic um, being ill at ease with existence itself, or they're suicidal, or they're going through some kind of crisis and they realize that this has questioned everything for them. So they are encountering these existential ideas themselves, and then they realize there is such a thing as existential work. So then they take it up. But it also happens that people just come for psychotherapy. They stumble upon a therapist who has an existential orientation, and then they discover that there are these ways in which they can reveal different aspects of life to themselves. So there are different pathways to finding out about existential therapy. Although more and more it is now well known. I mean, when I first started out in the field, people used to say, existential therapy? What on earth are you talking about? Isn't existentialism an old philosophical movement from the 50s and the 40s, even in France? Are you going back to those days, or are you going back to the 60s? What on earth are you talking about? Now it's not like that anymore. People have gotten used to it, and in psychotherapeutic circles, most people are aware that it is a modality that they need to learn about and that can expand the way they work, even if they're not going to train to be fully flown existential therapists. They might still want to use some of those ideas in their work.
And I mean, you almost see some of these, very significant existential ideas rippling through social media as well. And not that they're necessarily called existential ideas, but there's this big movement, which is a good thing, obviously, about authenticity and, getting the most out of your life. And, all these little threads that really come back to a lot of these ideas. And then obviously Rollo May's ideas. And I think in the beginning of the book, it was you were touching on Socrates and some of the Greek philosophers as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, because he, to me, has always seemed like one of the early existential therapists because he does exactly that same job. He speaks to young people who have opinions about life, but who feel that those opinions have perhaps not helped them very much.
Mm,
He sits down with them in the agora, in the Athens market, or walks about in the gardens there, and challenges them and questions them and gets them to think again about what they took for granted, or um, challenges their assumptions about life and makes them really begin to think much more carefully and to become self-reflective and to engage in dialogue, which is what existential therapy favors, to have a dialogue where we stand next to each other rather than being in competition. So, yes, Socrates is a fantastic role model, and the way in which he treated, well, we know him through Plato, obviously, and the way in which he treated all these important issues like justice and
mm,
courage and love is still exemplary. And it's still highly inspirational to read those dialogues. And I strongly recommend them to all of my students and trainees.
mm. It's his. I mean, his life is fascinating, isn't it? He
Yeah.
really, almost. I mean, well, not almost. He did. He did die for authenticity, for the sake of authenticity.
He certainly did. Yes, he certainly did. And that was quite a big thing. When I first encountered Socrates and Plato when I was probably about 12 or 13, because I went to classical education, so I studied Latin and Greek. And of course, the first years you didn't read things like that. But as you got better, we had special classes to read Plato. And when I began to really get the hang of these dialogues, and I started to read them in translation as well, in fairness, because it was quite hard to figure it all out in Greek, I became a total admirer of his, and he really changed my way of thinking about life and about the world. And I found it a huge relief that he had this voice, against those who would seek power or who would say anything in order to curry favor with those in power, and who demanded that we think again and that we listen to the Oracle of Delphi, to know ourselves and to start by thinking about who we are and what we know and what we don't know. And of course, his wonderful conclusion was that he didn't know anything and that he was only called wise because he was the one who knew that he didn't know. And I thought that was admirable. It was a wonderful way to reorientate myself in my life. And I decided sometime at the age of 17 that I would pursue truth for the rest of my life. I had no idea how I was exactly going to do that, but I started out, studying philosophy because I thought that's what would do it. But obviously, finding that a lot of philosophy wasn't really so much about truth as it was about argumentation, which is not quite
Mm.
the same thing.
Right.
So Socrates remained, outstanding for me amongst all the philosophers I studied. He always remained like a beacon of light, really.
That's so interesting that his ideas had such an effect on you at such a young age. Like, have you looked
Mm.
back on that time of your life and had to think about what you were searching for and why they were speaking to you?
Oh, well, yes, I was born in just a few years after the end of the Second World War in a country that was ravaged by the Second World War and where people had been in occupation for 5 years, which had meant people being shot in the streets, having nothing to eat, nothing to drink.
Mm.
My parents went hungry, nearly died. My father was in a work camp. My father also, when he went into the resistance, had to escape from the Germans and nearly died in that process. My grandparents' house was bombed by the British, and they lost everything they had and lost each other in the turmoil. I could carry on. Family members shot, family members deported to concentration camps. These were the stories I was told when I was growing up. And I was growing up in a country where there was nothing and where all around me there still were, the destroyed buildings and the empty spaces because of the bombings and many people I knew, parents of children in my class, had numbers tattooed on their arms. Um, it was a very scary world I grew up in, and I was really in need of that kind of understanding of why people do these things to each other. I could not understand that at all for the first, well, decade at least.
What conclusions did you come to with that? That's such a lovely open loop for us to really examine.
Why do people do that to each other? Well, I'd like to go with Socrates there, if I may. And as you know, he came to the conclusion that those who do evil always do it in ignorance, because he argued that once you know what is right and what is wrong, you will always want to do what is right. You might still not succeed in doing it, but you're very unlikely to opt to do evil deliberately. And this has been borne out by, everything I have observed over the following decades, that every war that was waged and is being waged, and every evil that people do to each other is always done on the basis of innocence. People always do special pleading. They always say, oh, but we have been attacked, or oh, if we don't do this, then that, or but they started first, or well, this is how it works. If I don't stand up for myself, nobody else will. There's always this kind of argument involved in it.
Yeah. Which again speaks to this idea that, the unexamined life is not worth living, and that it really is so important to know thyself, and how interesting that is. That actually ripples into a country's identity, and
Yep.
there's so many other spheres that sort of really speaks to.
Now you're saying a very big thing there because you're drawing the conclusion. And what you're basically now saying is that, there are f- little enough, well, small enough numbers of people who live the really examined life, but there are no nations that live an examined life in that way.
Mm.
They tend to live a strategic life and a competitive life and a fighting life, but there are very few nations that go back to first principles and that ask themselves what kind of ethics they want to pursue and what is wrong with the ethics that is dominating in that country. And this applies to almost every nation state in the world. It's very rare to hear politicians reminding themselves of the importance of thinking about these things and the values that they are really exhibiting in action rather than in words. It's quite bizarre when you think about it.
The idea about knowing yourself and really seeing to it that the path in life and the path of wisdom and the path of acceptance really is in never coming to a destination, but um, you know, trying to sort of wake up and be enthralled, if that's the right word, by the journey, really seems to be the conclusion that so many other philosophers have come to. You can hear that in Nietzsche, with the eternal recurrence. You can also hear that, and this is the segue that I wanted to dive into with you, Emmy. You can hear that in Heidegger's idea that the you can only ever pursue getting to know someone, and with Dasein and sort of really being here and being there. And as soon as you start to draw conclusions about someone else, you've really lost the true I thou relationship in a sense. Has that helped
Hmm.
you from a psychotherapeutic perspective?
Well, Heidegger's work, in the sense of his ideas about authenticity and inauthenticity. Well, I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but I did my doctorate on authenticity and inauthenticity in Heidegger in relation to psychotherapy. So you're probably
Perhaps I was
not
being a
aware of
bit indirect.
so yes, um, well, as you perhaps realize, what Heidegger concluded was that nobody can ever choose to be authentic or inauthentic because it is inevitable that we are going to be inauthentic much of the time. Inauthenticity being defined by Heidegger as following the they, the anonymous crowd, and letting yourself fall in with them and do what you think is expected of you or do as other people do, rather than coming to this reflective state of living where you do ask yourself what is true and what isn't true, and where you set the standard of reminding yourself of some of the truths that we like to deny. Most importantly, according to Heidegger, the fact of our mortality and the facing of our death, not just at the end of our life, but the many deaths we die each day in other ways. Every time you say something that you regret, every time you undertake something and then don't stick with it, or every time that you do something and you fail, and so you feel shame or regret about that. There are so many ways in which human beings are limited by life, and we try to forget about that, and we try to distract ourselves from all those things. And that distraction makes us kind of opaque to ourselves. We are no longer transparent to ourselves, and we're no longer capable of becoming a channel for truth and for what actually is the case. And it is this that causes many of the problems in the world, because when we're out of touch with what is really going on or what is really true, then we start to improvise and try to just, back to the same thing, win an argument rather than investigate, search, research, open things up, learn, change, be transformed, all of those things that can start to happen when we open our minds and our hearts to this different way of living. So it's very similar in some ways to Socrates' example. Heidegger does have a lot of that same aspiration to finding truth. The trouble with Heidegger is that he's very dogmatic about it all and very self-assured, whereas Socrates was extremely modest and very cautious and very fair-minded to other people. Whereas Heidegger always posits truth as if he's got some kind of privileged access to it. And I think that is also why he went wrong, because when you start to think that you hold truth, then it becomes very easy to mistake great big errors for truth. And, when he got involved with National Socialism briefly, but he still did, and sacked some good colleagues from the university because he had the power to do that and was asked to do that. He did not demonstrate truth values or generosity or any of those human values that one would expect to be at the foundation of a search for truth and good living.
Mm, mm. So
So that burns Heidegger quite a bit, doesn't
yes,
it,
yes,
in terms
especially
of a role model? Yeah.
when comparing to Socrates, the difference between sort of knowing a thing and then embodying it or living in accordance with those values,
Hmm.
Um,
In Socrates' case, to the death.
exactly, exactly. Which is something that I don't know if I could do it. I'd like to think that I could. I'd certainly write a hero in a book based on me doing that thing, but I don't know if I could do it.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah. That's
really.
always a very good question to confront yourself with. What would I stand up for? Would I do that? And I always think, well, I might be more like Galileo Galilei, who did do the research and did say Copernicus was right and, the earth turns around the sun. And then they took him to, basically get killed. But when he walked out of the church, he is said to have whispered under his breath, nevertheless, she turns around the sun.
Mm,
So
mm.
he hadn't given up. He decided to do right by Caesar, but to stay true to the sun, if you like,
Yes, yeah, yeah, the
and
sun
to
god.
truth. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So I always thought that would be my solution, that I would stay true in my heart and I would do whatever I could to be aligned to that. But if I had to get away with something, avoiding negativity or being put to death, I probably might go along with that in the same way in which if I got attacked, I wouldn't hesitate for a moment to lie and say, "Oh, I've just called the police," even if I hadn't. You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm devoted to truth, but there are certain conditions under which there are exemptions.
Emmy, one of Jean-Paul Sartre's probably most famous quotes is that existence precedes essence. And that's something that I really wanted to discuss with you because I seem to grapple with that and oscillate between yes and no almost by the day. This idea
I'm pleased to hear that.
yeah. Well, right. Trying to sort of, yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose you're right. If I did come to a decision on it, then I probably wouldn't be living the existential life. But this idea that existence precedes essence, I think, for me anyway, I'll just throw this into the ring and then I really love to see what your
Hmm.
thoughts are. That they were particularly important ideas for the time that Jean-Paul Sartre was around, especially with um, Simone de Beauvoir's ideas about, the second sex, and there's a role that women must play as opposed to women defining their own lives. But I suppose that the counter argument to that is that we are, again, to use Heidegger's ideas, thrown into this world with a set of preconditions, whether they're our cultural boundaries, our familial boundaries, the genetics that we take on from
Mm.
our parents. So, do you think that it is the case that existence truly precedes essence, or is it more of there's a bit of both going on there, in other words?
Well, I think Sartre is right in terms of how we live our lives. His argument was that we make choices by voting with our feet, and we engage in certain ways of being. And by being in that way, we then define who we become, and we define our way of life. And I think in that respect, he's right about that. But I do not believe that all that exists has existed first and then has its essence determined. I think this applies to human beings because we don't have a set essence. So, as human beings, and Heidegger would agree with that, as human beings, we come into the world as a lot of nothingness, Sartre says, and that nothingness needs to commit to something before it becomes anything. And therefore, only afterwards is our essence defined because we are being for itself rather than being in itself. But then the question is that true for being in itself? And I would certainly um, argue that it isn't, that the way the universe is has certain essential qualities that are not being determined by, certainly not by human beings living their lives, but also probably not just by the way the universe is transforming the whole time and evolving the whole time. But I've said it, it's nevertheless a process of evolution and change. So both of these things are true in a way. There is some kind of essential pattern that is being acted out by the change and the movement. But then that change and that movement creates a kind of new essence, and out of that something else. It's a dialectical process. And
Hmm.
I think at the end of his career, Sartre agreed with that too. So this idea of existence precedes essence was very much the being and nothingness idea. But in his critique for dialectical reason and other books like Flaubert, he makes it very clear that there is an interplay between existence and essence, and that out of the one comes the other. And so he, for instance, took the view that at the end of his life, that people are actually defined or characterized by what they make out of what they have been made.
Hmm.
So he saw it as a process of mutuality and impact, but he always stayed true to the notion that human beings can alter their fate and have a lot of free will in shaping their lives, and that indeed how you shape your life then becomes the kind of mold out of which certain situations arise. So
Hmm.
it's it's a bit of both, and I think it is a dialectical process, and the existence and the essence are kind of like the thesis and the antithesis, and really what's happening is a constant renewal between the two.
That feels really right, I think, intuitively. This idea
Mm,
you are a ball of clay and you can mold yourself, but you can't choose the type of clay that you were given or how much you will
Exactly.
learn. You know,
Exactly.
you've got
There's
some,
clearly lots of givens.
there's lots of givens. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and
Yeah.
one of the biggest ones that you bring into this is existential anxiety, right? Which is I suppose, different from Yalom's notions of the four givens. Well, I mean, he speaks about anxiety a lot in that, but was was his work important to you when you were specifically when you were writing this book? Because I know this was in the 80s, I think, from memory, the first.
No, no, no. I was already writing that book before Yalom had published his book. I was already teaching all this in the 70s,
That's
and I took my inspiration from other people. I took my inspiration. I did take my inspiration from Rollo May, though, I
mm,
have to say. Rollo May's book Existence was significant to help me develop my ideas, but Yalom was later.
mm,
But I did take a lot also from earlier people. So Karl Jaspers, for instance, and obviously Heidegger and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Camus and Merleau-Ponty and all those people, and also Husserl very much, and my own teacher, Michel Henry, who was a Husserlian, and also all the practitioners that had tried to apply these kinds of philosophical idea before me. And that was, in first instance, Ludwig Binswanger, who
mm,
was really the first practitioner that I became familiar with. Secondly, Karl Jaspers, who I knew both as philosopher and as psychiatrist, and his book on psychopathology was very important. And then Medard Boss and his Daseinsanalysis. So those were the influences in terms of my own development of my therapeutic practice. But of course, when Yalom started to publish, I mean, I knew Yalom when he was a group analyst and wrote books about groups. And I was very interested in him having discovered that existential issues are an important factor in how groups move on or how people learn in groups. And I was amazed when he actually published a book on existential psychotherapy because nobody was speaking about existential psychotherapy
mm,
in those days at all. And he took a huge risk publishing that book. And it took many years before people took real notice of that book. Um, but of course, I had come to the UK to work with R.D. Laing, and R.D. Laing was very inspired by Sartre and saw his work as implementing some Sartrean ideas. So it was important for me to see what he had to say for himself. So I worked with him for a year or so and then on and off later on. But he had not really succeeded in developing an existential therapy. He stayed very much at the level of critiquing what was happening in psychiatry and well, trying to liberate especially schizophrenic patients from having certain treatments imposed on them and giving them back the freedom, as he used to say, to live through their madness and discover what that was really about and have a breakthrough rather than a breakdown. So those were the ideas that influenced me. Um, and when Yalom's book came out, I felt encouraged by it, and I think it made a huge difference that this was going on in the USA as well as in the UK. And from the UK, it spread around the rest of Europe very rapidly. And so, with Yalom getting more and more well known, and lots of people around the world being interested in all the work we were doing in the UK and Europe, suddenly it just took on a life of its own and it became a thing.
mm,
It's
mm,
quite strange to see something like that happening in your lifetime, when you really think, oh, well, I'm in an obscure area nobody's interested in.
Yes.
But
Yes.
then now it has become a bandwagon almost that many people want to jump on, which is scary too. I don't know
Yes.
which I prefer.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I wonder if it's got something to do with the rise of postmodernism and this sort of skepticism of grand narratives and without the safety barrier of a god or a way in which to live or what it means to be a woman or a man or whatever it is, right?
A
This
human being. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. These existential ideas emerging from beneath to sort of say, well, it's up to you now, like you
Yeah.
define your own life and it almost seems to me to be like the only way to think about it, given how skeptical we are of all these old ideas. And
It's all we've got left, really.
right,
It's the only philosophy that makes sense in the world as it is today. And I think more and more people are realizing that. I mean, some people have opted for humanism, but I think people realize that that is a bit too narrow because that puts the human being too much in the driving seat. And we are just becoming aware that that has led to catastrophic consequences. So, clearly, a humanistic philosophy is not going to do the trick anymore. We need a philosophy that is more wide-ranging and that makes room for nature and that makes room for the universe and that makes room for values and that makes room for, um, well, a diversity of different layers of life rather than just putting all the emphasis on humanity. So there aren't really many other philosophies that can do that right now.
yeah, yeah. Emmy, let's transition into psychotherapy specifically.
Mm-mm.
When you're working with someone and you're seeing their issue, perhaps whether they see it or not through an existential lens, what are the sort of questions that we want to start asking to evoke some of these deeper themes?
Um, well, just the same as with other forms of therapy, I just always start by inviting the person to tell me what it is that brings them to my consulting room and what it is they need help with, what it is they feel caught up in, and how can they explain to me how that has come about and give me a bit of perspective on their lives. So we just start with a very wide range of um, looking at an overview, really, of where they're coming from. And I will usually also ask them a little bit about where they are situated now, where they are coming from, and where they are going. So I inject some ideas about progression and time and how things are generated from certain things happening to them and how now it's in their hands to think about how they want to remold that or redefine that or understand that in a new way or put it in a wider perspective. And then from there, we start to look at the more fine-grained things. They'll come with specifics, this is what's happening, and I don't understand why this is happening and why I always do this or why this always happened to me. So then we go into, opening it up and pulling it apart and unraveling what has been woven in their lives, unraveling it so that they get back to a situation where they can start reweaving their lives. So it is a very painstaking process. It is a slow process. I'm not into shortcuts or quick remedies or anything like that, but it's always extremely satisfying, and people always get the hang of it very quickly because it's a natural thing to be doing. And people love to begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together again or to weave these threads together in a way that is much more solid and makes more sense, or that gives them more of a sense of direction or more of a sense of overview, or that gives them a chance to think again about what their original project, as Sartre would say, would call
Mm.
it, what their original project is, what their purpose is, and what they want to really dedicate themselves to, what is worth living for, rather than what is it that annoys me, or what is it that triggers me, or what is it that's happened that I can't forget about. It becomes a much bigger search for what they had lost, what they had never found yet, what they had not even realized was important to them. But now that they know that it is important, they are very eager to understand better all the time and to just keep adding understanding and information and realize that they can make sense of it for themselves. They don't need me to interpret it. Once they're beginning to get the hang of it, I'm just the guide who says, remember how you did this then? Or can you see where that leads? Or what would happen if this? And what would happen if that? So I am like the philosophical guide who sometimes holds them by the hand, sometimes says, go for it. But in the end, it's for them to learn to do this stuff in their own lives because that's what they're going to be doing for the rest of their lives. And they need to enjoy it and they need to want to do it. Not, it's not something I'm doing to them. I might do it for them and with them for a bit, but it's not something I'm going to end up doing for them forever. So
Right.
it's very much about passing the wisdom on and bringing people back in touch with their inner light, which has often been doused or has never even been lit yet.
Mm. Mm. One of the things that I found really helpful in my 20s when I came across existential therapy and when I really needed it was actually how humbling it is. You know, when we confront these givens, as Yalom would say, it it doesn't make you feel that like it sort of takes you away from this idea that life is meant to be joyous and we're meant to have a happy life, right? But there's a grounding that occurs, I think, when we really are able to confront our condition. How do you navigate that with a client who's really struggling to come to terms with our fleetingness and our perhaps our, you know, this lack of inherent meaning and all of those big concepts that we don't necessarily that they don't necessarily feel comfortable, right?
Yes. Well, my view is very different to that. I
Mm,
believe that there is a lot of inherent meaning in life, and that we forgetting to look at that. It's, as always, both this and that.
yes.
So there are certain givens, but they're not quite the same, perhaps, at what Yalom talks about, because I take my idea about the givens from many different philosophers. And so I'm a great believer in getting people to start looking at things again and to rediscover the magic of their own consciousness and the magic of their own bodies, the amazing capacities they have just to breathe and just to be able to make sense of the world. The fact that there is an amazing array of nature out there with hundreds of species of animals and, seasons that are astonishing and other patterns like the diurnal patterns and day and night and I don't know, summer and winter, it's all pretty amazing. And
Yes.
all these things are given to us. And all of these systems and all of these procedures and processes are deeply meaningful in and of themselves. So some people find it quite enough to work as a vet and work with animals because they are confronted with sick animals, and there's plenty of meaning in healing those animals. They don't need anything beyond that. So there is lots of meaning. If you want to have a life of meaning, you can find it in so many different ways. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about the kind of moments that we come to a halt and things have broken down for us and we have lost important values in our lives. And so we feel depleted and we feel devoid of meaning and devoid of values. And at those times, of course, we go through what I call an existential crisis, which means that our lives fall apart in lots of different ways, and it seems like there is nothing to fill it up with because everything is absurd and meaningless. But actually, at those moments, the person is in the vacuum, which you can also call nothingness, but you can also call freedom.
Mm.
And at that point, if you are willing to sit with that terror sometimes, that anxiety certainly, and maybe that despair sometimes, and you can allow yourself to carry yourself through the dark nights of your soul, then as you know, I can see that you know this and you've done this, you discover incredible resources and reservoirs of meaning, not just in yourself, but in your relationship to life, in your relationship to the world, to the planet, to the universe, the cosmos, to other people. And you realize that you've been given a brain that is actually capable of learning lots of things, and that that very process of learning to address such problems and such meaninglessness is an intensely meaningful and meaning-giving process. And that to reach out to other people who are in that same situation is always an intensely meaning creating process as well. And that there are lots of other ways in which meaning can be generated. You know, Frankl is, of course, a good one to read on that because that was basically what he did with his logotherapy to show how meaning is found or created or extracted even
Mm.
from situations, and how you can also create it, but how you can also find it in discovering that you are free to determine your own attitude to whatever it is that is happening in your life at the time. So it's very rich. That is a very enterprising journey, a very demanding journey, but it is always a journey that leads people to realize that they've just come to life. They've been asleep and they've had a catastrophe. They thought it was the end. They might want to die, but here they are. And now they are awake and they start to understand what they've never understood. And it's amazing. It's wondrous. It's awesome. It's magic.
Yeah, yeah. And it's such a privilege to just be with someone. You know, I'm obviously preaching to the choir here, but it's why we do what we do, right? It's just being with someone as they
Yeah,
discover that. I
it's
think
a privilege.
total
It's a
privilege.
huge privilege.
Yeah, yeah. We have to talk about dreams. I love
Yes.
analyzing dreams, and rarely does a morning go by where my wife and I aren't looking at each other like, "Hey, what did you dream about?" And oh, I was on this boat again, or whatever it is. Um, how useful a dream? I mean, I'm preempting this a little bit because that was one of my favorite chapters in the book. But how important are dreams to you in helping people discover themselves and discover their life's purpose?
Hmm. Well, it's interesting. You should ask that. Very Few people ask me about my dream work, but it's a big thing I've always done, and I've always enjoyed doing it. In fact, when I came to speak at the third or fourth World Congress for Psychotherapy in Sydney,
Hmm.
I did a big dream workshop, and you can find it on YouTube
Oh,
even
cool.
today. Yeah, I mean, that's like a 15-year-old tape. I
Oh,
work
amazing.
with an Australian lady on her dreams. It's quite interesting. Yes, there's three parts to it. It's three videos. This was a
Okay.
long piece of work. I I think it's always a very good way to get an understanding of how the person is in the world. So a dream is like a story in a nutshell. And it is not just any old story. It is a story that the dreamer has written at night without, getting their brain involved too much in censoring things. So it is a very genuine, from the heart story they have written. So it's fantastic to practice phenomenology on dreams. And I do that in a very systematic way as well. And I call that structural existential analysis. And it consists in applying various layers of investigation to the dream, starting out by looking at the dream. Well, of course, you do all these other things. You get the person to tell you the dream again in the present sense, and you ask them for all the feelings and what things look like, and you ask them to be like the film producer who will tell you everything you need to know in order to really be able to be there with them in the dream, not just hear it as a story. And then once they've done that, you have lots of material to organize in the four worlds. So, what have they told you about the way they are physically in the world? What are they telling you about their body? What is happening there? Are they embodied or are they absent from their body? Are they spectators or are they actors?
Mm.
Are they dominant? So now we go to the social world. Are they dominant with other people? Are they being dominated? Are they visible or invisible? Are they um, guiding the action or not? Lots of things. Are they in conflict? Are they peacemaking? You name it. What's happening in their social relationships? And then how are they there as a person? What are the character traits of the protagonist of that dream? Is that person being friendly? Is that person being astute? Is that person being upset? What is happening to them as a person in that world? And then finally, what are the values that are being expressed by that dream? What is this person after? So what is the project, right? What is it that they're clearly trying to achieve? How would you sum up that dream? What is the verb? So, who is the protagonist? What is it they're doing? And how are they going about it? And gradually, as you apply all these filters, all these lenses through which you look at the dream, so you don't have to interpret it because when you describe exactly what it is that is actually in the dream, it speaks for itself and it becomes obvious.
Yes. Yes. And it's so this I think because it's also a confronting idea in itself, right? That there's a dream weaver, or there's, not necessarily someone obviously,
Yeah, yeah,
but there's
yeah.
this thing going on in you that almost can reveal more parts about you than you're actually able to consciously perceive. It
Yeah.
has a lot of implications about what it means to be a human being and how much control we have, in a sense.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, this is the whole discussion about the unconscious, isn't it? And so, what we call that in existential work is everything that is forgotten or that is implicit rather than explicit, or everything that is not currently thought about, but that is still there and that can be looked at if you want to. So it's obvious that there is so much happening in the world, and there's so much happening in your life, and there's so much happening in your head, in your brain at any one time. So there's always a process of selection going on. But that doesn't mean that all the stuff that you select out is unconscious. It is just not in awareness at the moment, but it is there, ready to be recalled or called up into your awareness when you want to. Sartre, of course, was the person who wrote about that a lot and who showed that the distinction between reflective and pre-reflective consciousness is much more important than consciousness and unconsciousness.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And just I suppose the idea being to just get in touch with those parts of yourself again that we sort of didn't necessarily let go of to jump on your bandwagon there, but just left
Mm.
behind in a way as we became adults and we learnt about responsibility and taking care of others.
Yes, exactly. It's about allowing yourself to open your eyes to all these strands that have been lost, or all these things that you have neglected really a lot of the time, because we tend to eliminate so many things from our life because we have to. We tend to be very focused and have a very narrow commitment to very few things, or as Sartre would say, to very few character traits, or very few or simple ways of being. And so we live in bad faith. We imagine that this is all we are, when actually, all the while, we have that capacity for these other ways of beings. But we lie to ourselves, we deceive ourselves, we tell ourselves, no, I'm just like this, or I'm just like that. But it is never true. People are capable of a huge variety of emotions, a huge variety of professions they could do, of skills they could acquire, of languages they could speak, of relationships they could create. It's endless, but it's overwhelming.
Mm,
So we prefer to narrow it down and to pretend to ourselves that we are just this.
mm,
But that makes it difficult when change needs to happen, because we might become frozen in that pattern, and that makes it difficult to have the flexibility to go with the flow when we need to, and to change and to transform ourselves and to become more than we were rather than less, even though we've lost something.
Never thought of it like that. That's so helpful just to view, and this is these aren't the words used exactly, but to view being so point A to B oriented almost as a defense mechanism to protect us from just floating and drifting with the immense possibility of how we could be in the world.
Mm, that's
That's
right. It's
really
a
helpful.
pathway we choose. We choose a direction, and then we choose a path amongst all the path that's going in that direction, and it gets narrower and narrower, and we end up believing, well, this is just us, or this is our
Yes.
fate, or we haven't got the ability, or we can't be anything else. But actually, it's not true. I've seen amazing transformations in people over the years. It's quite extraordinary what people are capable of
Mm,
doing. Just, to take an example, the way people can rehabilitate themselves after they've had serious accidents, or after they have been through terrible catastrophes, and how they can come out of these things so much the stronger and so much the wiser for it, when everybody thought that would be the end of them.
It's so true, isn't it? We just forget it. I've
Forget
just been
it.
reminded of that now.
Yes.
So thank you.
Well, and also there is something in our culture that makes us think about people who are either capable or people who are incapable of things. And there is this whole culture about once you're traumatized, then you're stuck and you
Mm,
can't have these facilities anymore. And it's just not true. You might go through a phase where you are very slowed down by having been through troubles and difficulties and traumatic and dramatic events, but people can survive. I mean, I saw this from the start of my life. As I said, I was surrounded by people who had lived through some of the worst things imaginable. I mean, I couldn't I couldn't imagine for a long time that I was a worthy person because I hadn't been through those things. And actually earlier before that, I kind of imagined I had been through these things because I almost imagined we were still in the war because everybody was constantly talking about it. But then, seeing what happened to some of those people and how they used this adversity to understand things better and to do some really good things in the world is very uplifting and very encouraging. And we need to hear much more about those kinds of things. We hear very little about these kinds of things.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. And I think that's where, you know, your ideas on existential therapy are different in a good way. They're
Mm.
exciting. They make you think about what can be and what you can do. And I think we need more of that, especially um, in this day and age, right, where everyone's skeptical of everything and there's no truth
Yeah,
anymore.
totally. Yeah, and we're so quick to say, oh, this is too much, too much. People are strong. People are resourceful. People are adaptable. This is what Einstein said. It's not cleverness and knowledge that's going to save the world. What is going to save the world is people who are adaptable. Adaptability is where it's at.
Mm.
Evolution is where it's at. And human beings are evolutionary in the most remarkable ways.
Yeah, yeah, and that really speaks to that idea of new meaning making when we lose our identity, and what can be. So mourning what was and grieving what was, and
Oh, yes. You go slow. You go
you go
slow.
slow. You
You,
go
you
slow.
don't go, oh, now I've lost everything. Now I'm going to be really brave. You go slow. You stay with that process
Right.
and you take time to let it go and to feel it because otherwise the saving grace will not arrive. It arrives in the pain. It arrives in the sorrowing. It arrives in that long painstaking process of allowing yourself to let go and then to feel the rising of the energy and the realization that you've learned so much in that process that this energy is going to get used in a very different way,
Mm.
in a much more pointed way, in a much more purposeful way.
Emmy, I know we have to come to a close here soon, but I really wanted to ask you this question when you were telling me about your formative years and when you really fell in love with Socrates' ideas and so on. If you could go back and meet that young girl or that teenager at 17, what do you think you might say to her?
Well, you don't know the half of it because uh, the girl of 17 attempted suicide twice,
Wow.
and I did very nearly die. And so I would say to that suicidal girl, there is room in the world for you. Not only is there room in the world for you, the world needs you. The world needs you because you're sensitive enough to hurt about things that are unjust and to feel that that's wrong and that truth matters and that love matters and that kindness matters and that justice matters. And we need more people like you in the world, not fewer. And therefore, go and find other people who are like-minded. Remember Socrates, remember the other philosophers that you can trust and rely on. And there are lots of novelists like that too. And lots of artists and lots of musicians. So go find all these like-minded people and get on your way and discover what you can do to make the world a little bit better so that other people like you will find a helping hand when they need it. That's what I would say to her.
Wow.
And
Well,
in a way, I discovered that for myself, but nobody actually said it in so many words.
yes, yes, yes. Well, I needed you, so thank you. This book was really helpful
Well,
to me.
that's a lovely thing to say. Thank you. That's
Really
very
was
nice.
really helpful to me.
Good.
I mean, I read it uh, for me first and foremost, and then if it helps in my practice, then that's great. But fundamentally selfish reasons, and it really helped. It really helped. I think
That's great.
specifically, the chapter on spirituality was really fun. I really enjoyed that. It's not something you necessarily come across all the time when you're reading the existential literature.
Nope. But
So
it's important. It's an important part of human existence. And meaning making is a spiritual activity.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you so much.
So I will put this on my YouTube channel if it's possible
Of
as
course.
well,
Yeah, yeah. I
because there are a
can
lot of
send this
people who'd
through.
like to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That was going to be my final question. Where can people find you, Emmy?
Yeah, well, they can find me on social media and particularly on my YouTube channel where I actually will answer questions and engage with people in the comment section of my videos. And I hope to see many of you there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure.
See you.